I discovered that my husband and my lawyer, daughter-in-law, were plotting to destroy me. What they didn't expect was that a retired teacher like me still had a lot left to teach them. My name is Barbara Miller. I'm 64 years old. And for 35 years, I believed I was living in a dream marriage. As a retired literature teacher, I've always been organized and perceptive. Maybe that's exactly why it took me so long to notice what was happening right under my nose. That day was just an ordinary Thursday in March. I stopped by my son Paul's house to bring some cookies I'd baked for my 6-year-old granddaughter, Sophie. The 15-minute drive through the small town on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, always made me happy. Watching the rows of maple trees just starting to turn, signaling the arrival of spring. But as I turned onto the street where Paul lived with his wife, Susan, my heart nearly stopped. My husband Richard's silver Toyota Camry was parked in the garage as if it belonged there. But it absolutely did not. That very morning, Richard himself had said he'd be spending the whole day at the downtown auto shop working on a difficult customer's car. I stopped a few yards away. A strange tightness in my chest. A woman's intuition rarely fails. Something was wrong. I walked slowly toward the gate, careful not to make a sound. The living room curtains were drawn just enough to leave a narrow slit just wide enough for me to see inside. And through that gap, my 35-year marriage shattered in seconds. Richard was sitting comfortably on the sofa, not like a man under stress handling an emergency, but relaxed, legs crossed, as if he were at home. Next to him, Susan sat with a stack of papers on the coffee table, but they weren't household bills or legal files. I recognized them instantly, divorce papers. My first reaction was utter confusion. Why was Richard helping Susan with divorce papers? Could she be a client? But then I heard the words that froze my blood. "Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything?" Susan asked, running her hand through her blonde hair in a way I'd never seen before. "Barbara has no clue," my husband replied, his voice as cold as a blade. "She's busy with tutoring sessions and taking care of the granddaughter. She never notices when I leave the house." I gripped the iron fence to keep from falling. My knees were trembling. But the worst was still to come. "Perfect," Susan said, flipping through the papers. "We'll stick to the original plan. You file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. With the new law, I guarantee you'll get at least half the assets." "What about the downtown apartment we rent out?" Richard asked. "That's trickier since it's in her name. But the house you're living in, that's the main piece. Even though it's in her name from before the marriage, we can argue joint investment over 35 years. With the right judge, you can at least get a hefty settlement." I felt like someone had thrown cold water in my face. That house, the one I'd inherited from my mother, titled in my name before I even met Richard. The house where I raised Paul, where Sophie took her first steps, where I'd spent my life tending every corner. And now they were plotting to take it from me. "And the savings account," my husband went on, his tone like a man haggling over a used car. "Years of marriage and joint property laws are enough for you to claim half of the post-marriage savings." Savings. The small plot of land back home. The belongings. It all adds up to a pretty sizable sum. A pretty sizable sum. 35 years of marriage reduced to the phrase, "a pretty sizable sum." 35 years of washing his shirts, packing his lunches, nursing him through pneumonia, waking up in the middle of the night when his stomach pain almost sent him to the hospital. But what hurt me most was Susan's cold voice, the young woman I'd welcomed with open arms when she married my son 8 years ago. The young lawyer, to whom I'd sent her first client. The mother of my little granddaughter, whom I'd cared for every weekend so they could rest. "You're sure she hasn't suspected you coming over here more often?" Susan asked again, her voice carrying a different shade now, not just business, but something more intimate. "Come on, Susan," Richard replied, "after 35 years. Do you think I don't know how to handle Barbara? She's always predictable. Always. Predictably." That word rang in my head like a funeral bell. And what about Paul? Susan asked. He's busy at the bank. When he gets home, he just watches TV with a beer. If anyone asks, I'll say I'm helping you two fix up the house. Fix up the house. What a bitter irony. My husband was fixing up his life by tearing mine apart with my own daughter-in-law as his accomplice. Susan stood up and walked toward the window, the very spot where I was standing. My heart nearly burst out of my chest. But thankfully, she just pulled the curtain fully closed. Papers rustled. Their voices dropped until I could no longer make out the words. I staggered back to my car, my legs shaking like a child learning to walk. Inside, my hands trembling, I opened my phone and started recording everything I'd just witnessed. I knew I had to capture every detail while the memory was still fresh. The 15-minute drive home became the longest drive of my life. Every turn, every red light. Those words echoed in my head. She's predictable. Always. As if 35 years of living together had been nothing more than a convenient habit, now just an obstacle to his plan. When I got home, Richard still hadn't returned. I sat in the kitchen, the place where we'd shared coffee for over 3 decades, and I cried harder than I had since the day my mother died. But this time, the tears weren't only grief. There was anger too. A cold, calculating anger rising in my chest like a controlled fire. At 64. After a lifetime of being a devoted wife, a giving mother, a loving grandmother, I discovered I'd been betrayed, not just by a man, but by an entire family scheme meant to strip me of everything. But they made a fatal mistake, underestimating a retired teacher who had spent 40 years drilling unruly children to respect discipline and consequences. And if there's one thing I learned from those decades in the classroom, it's this: when you catch someone cheating, the first thing you do is gather all the evidence before taking action. That night, when Richard came home with his rehearsed excuse about trouble at the auto shop, I smiled and asked how his day had gone. He lied, looked me straight in the eye, as naturally as if he were talking about the weather. It was in that moment I decided if they wanted to play dirty, I'd show them what it looked like when a seasoned teacher played to win. The next 3 days were the strangest of my life. I still woke up, made breakfast, just like always. I asked Richard about his plans for the day, then quietly watched him lie to my face with the ease of someone commenting on the rain. I'll be staying late at the shop tonight. Barb, he said, using the nickname that once melted my heart, but now sounded as fake as a counterfeit coin. There's this truck engine that's giving me a headache. A headache. If only he knew my real headache, realizing my entire marriage had been nothing but an empty lie. Yet what hurt more than the betrayal was the fact that I had been blind for so long. I began noticing the little things I used to ignore. How he was always neatly dressed when leaving the house, even to a grease-covered garage. How he'd started using that expensive cologne I once thought was just about feeling confident, past 60. How he had always come home at lunchtime, but lately arrived late, claiming he'd stopped for a beer with clients. Beer, clearly. That was the beer of an affair. On Wednesday afternoon, I decided to test something. Around 3 o'clock, I called the shop. Hello? This is Richard's garage. The voice was Jason, an employee who'd been there for over 10 years. Hi, Jason. This is Barbara. Is Richard there, Mrs. Barbara? He left early. Said he had something important to take care of. I thought you knew. Something important to take care of. I hung up, my stomach twisting with that unique ache only the betrayed understand. It was just 3:15. I grabbed the keys to my Ford Focus and drove straight to my son Paul's house. This time, I didn't bother sneaking. The silver Camry was right there under the oak tree, as natural a part of the scenery as a mailbox. I parked across the street and waited. At 4:20, the front door opened. First came Susan, glancing around nervously as if checking for prying eyes. Then Richard walked out, Not like a father-in-law leaving his son's home, but like a man stepping out of his lover's house. The details betrayed them completely, the way she fixed his hair before he got into the car, the lingering wave at the doorway until he disappeared around the corner. And most of all, the conspiratorial smiles. They shared the smile of people guarding a sweet secret. My stomach twisted so hard, I had to open the car door to keep from throwing up right there. 35 years of marriage. And now I realized I had lost my husband to my own daughter-in-law, the mother of my granddaughter, Sophie. The woman I'd once helped find her first job. The same person I welcomed at my dinner table every Sunday. But the nightmare didn't end there. I waited until Richard's car was gone, then drove around the block before heading home. That's when I witnessed something that froze my blood. Susan stood at the gate, chatting with Mrs. Clark, the neighborhood's most notorious gossip. From their body language, I knew this wasn't small talk about the weather. I parked 2 houses away, rolled down the window, and pretended to scroll on my phone. She really doesn't suspect anything. Does she, Mrs. Clark asked, her voice eager like someone savoring a scandal. How could she? Susan laughed softly. Richard says she's so naive. Always busy tutoring kids. Never paying attention. Naive. So my 35 years of trust had been reduced to a weakness. So when are you two going public? The neighbor pressed, practically drooling with curiosity. Not yet, Susan replied with a sly smile. First, he has to finalize the divorce. You know how it is? Do it properly, so he doesn't lose anything in the settlement. Doesn't lose anything. They were discussing my life as if it were a business deal to be wrapped up neatly. And what about Paul, Mrs. Clark asked. Paul has no idea. He thinks his dad's just helping with repairs around the house. Men are clueless about these things. Just as clueless as his mother. And Sophie, doesn't the little girl notice her grandpa being around so much? On the contrary, Susan answered, her voice turning sharp and calculating. Sophie adores her grandpa. Even better, she'll have a stronger father figure around, since Paul is too busy all the time. A more present father figure. They were planning to erase my existence from my granddaughter's life and replace me with their version of a perfect family, one where I no longer had a place. I drove home like a machine, my mind adrift. When I arrived, I sat at the kitchen table and cried until no tears were left. But after the tears came something else, something colder than I had ever felt before. I went into the bedroom, opened Richard's closet, and began searching. In the pocket of his jeans, I found a crumpled slip of paper, a motel receipt downtown, dated 2 weeks earlier. For an entire afternoon, the same day he claimed he had driven to another city to meet a client for an estimate. In the pocket of his shirt, I found something even worse, a shopping list in Susan's handwriting. But it wasn't for Paul's household, it was for an apartment living room curtains. A small rug, queen-size sheets, a coffee maker. They were building a lover's nest with the sweat and tears of my life. That night, when Richard came home with the same excuse about trouble at the shop, I was ready, but not to confront him. I had only just begun my own investigation. How was your day, darling? I asked as I set down the carefully prepared dinner. Tiring, he answered, not even bothering to look at me. That engine just wouldn't quit. I understand. I smiled. You were so busy you didn't even have time for a proper lunch. Right. Yeah. I just grabbed a sandwich there. Lies, Jason had already told me he left the shop long before lunchtime. I'm glad you managed to get everything sorted, I said, studying every flicker of expression on his face. Busy again tomorrow? Not sure, depends on the clients. Clients. How interesting that he now called my own daughter-in-law his client. After dinner, while he sat watching TV, I went into the bedroom and called my sister Martha in Boston, a retired accountant. Martha, I need your help with something. I tried to keep my voice steady. Of course. Barb, What is it? If someone wanted to protect themselves financially in a divorce, what should they do? There was silence on the other end. Barbara. What's going on over there? I can't explain everything yet. But I need to know how to protect what belongs to me. Practical, as always. Martha cut straight to the point. First, write down everything, every account, every asset, anything in your name before the marriage. Second, open a separate account. Do not, under any circumstances, let him know about it. Third, if you suspect he's moving money, freeze the joint account. Can I even do that? Of course you can. Either spouse has the legal right to freeze a joint account if there's suspicion of unusual activity. That's legal protection. Legal protection. Finally, a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. One more thing. Barb, she added, if you're asking me these questions, it means you've already discovered something. Be smart. Don't confront him yet. Gather enough evidence first. I hung up with a plan already forming in my mind. They thought they were dealing with a naive retired teacher who would spend the rest of her days weeping quietly in the corner. But they had forgotten one important detail. Teachers aren't just instructors, we are born investigators. We spend our lives spotting lies, catching cheats, seeing through every attempt to fool us. And when we discover dishonesty, we know exactly how to handle it. The next morning, when Richard left for another busy day at the garage, I headed out too. I went straight to the bank where we'd had a joint account for over 20 years. Good morning, Mr. James. I greeted the manager, who had known our family for years. Mrs. Barbara. Such a pleasure to see you. How can I help you today? I need to review our joint account. There have been some unusual transactions, and I want to understand them better. 2 hours later, I walked out with a thick stack of statements and a discovery that made my blood boil over the past 3 months. Richard had withdrawn nearly $6,000 from our savings, always in small amounts to avoid suspicion. $6,000. That was the money I had earned from weekend English tutoring sessions. Scraped together penny by penny, with the dream of one day visiting my younger brother, a trip I had promised myself for years. $6,000. Wasted on dates, gifts, and setting up their secret apartment. At that moment, the retired teacher inside me died, and a new woman was born, a woman they had never known. The feeling was the same as grading a test and realizing the student hadn't just cheated, but cheated badly. That was exactly how I felt as I began to investigate my husband's double life. They thought they were clever, but they were making amateur mistakes. I spent the entire weekend organizing everything, as if preparing a lesson plan. I pulled out the old briefcase I once used for teaching and divided it into sections: infidelity evidence, financial transactions, event timeline, and action plan. 40 years in the classroom had given me something they never anticipated: method. On Monday morning, when Richard once again left to handle a problem at the shop, I set my plan in motion. First, stop the school where I still tutored. I met Rose, the retired principal, and a dear friend. Rose, I need you to help me with something a little unusual, I said, sitting down in the familiar teacher's lounge. Just say it. Barb, you know you can count on me. I need someone to teach me how to use my phone to record conversations. You know, we're from another generation. Rose gave me the kind of look only a 67-year-old woman can give her friend when she senses something is wrong. Barbara, what's going on? I told her everything, every detail, every discovery, every lie. By the time I finished, Rose's eyes were wet with angry tears. Those bastards, she slammed her hand on the table. 35 years. Barb, how could they? That's why I need to learn how to record. If I'm going to expose a fraud, I need evidence. Rose immediately called her 16-year-old granddaughter, Julia, who was doing homework nearby. Julia, come teach Aunt Barbara how to record on WhatsApp. In just an hour. I was fluent in technology, the recorder. How to send voice messages. How to back everything up to the cloud, all the skills a grandma detective could need. One more thing. Aunt Barbara, Julia said firmly, with the confidence only youth can carry. If you really want to catch them, you have to keep everything exactly the same. Don't change a single habit, or they'll get suspicious. I knew I was right to trust the clarity of the young. I left not only with knowledge, but with renewed determination. Next stop, Paul's house. But this time, not to spy, this was an official grandmother's visit. Grandma Sophie squealed when she saw me at the gate. Did you bring candy? Of course. Sweetheart, I said, handing her the box of fudge I had baked on purpose. Where's your mom? Susan came out, her face clearly startled to see me. Oh, mother-in-law, what a surprise. I thought I'd stop by to see my granddaughter, I said, sitting down on the sofa, and also to talk with you. I caught a flicker of tension in her eyes. What about oh? Just family matters. You've been so busy with work. We rarely get a chance to sit down. We chatted about little things for an hour while I observed. The way she checked her phone every 5 minutes. The way her body stiffened when I mentioned Richard. The way she quickly changed the subject when I noted how often he'd been leaving the shop lately. But the moment that stunned me came from Sophie. With the innocent honesty only a child can have. Grandma. Why does Richard only come here when Daddy's not home? The whole room went silent. Susan turned beet red. Well, sweetie, she stammered. He just comes to help me with things around the house. But why is it always when Daddy's not here? Sophie pressed on. In that straightforward way children have. Because that's when he has more free time, Susan muttered. I smiled, looking at my granddaughter. That's right, Sophie. Your grandpa sure does have a lot of free time. When I left, my heart was shattered, not just from betrayal, but from realizing they were pulling my innocent granddaughter into their web of lies. A 6-year-old sensed something was wrong, while the adults assumed she understood nothing. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Columbus and stepped into a store I never thought I'd enter, a security equipment shop. Good afternoon, I told the young clerk. I need a small recorder. What will you be using it for? Mom, to record lectures. I lied without blinking. I'm a teacher, and I want to capture my lessons so the students can review them at home. I left with a digital recorder, no bigger than a USB stick, and an instruction manual. It cost $200 from the money I earned tutoring. But it was worth every cent. Back home, I practiced until I was confident I had mastered it. I tried hiding it in different spots, my purse, my shirt pocket, even my sleeve. I was ready for the operation. By Wednesday, the opportunity finally arrived. Richard claimed he had to go give an estimate for a company in the industrial district. A laughable lie. He had never once worked with any big company. I waited until he left. Then 15 minutes later, I called Susan. Hi, Susan. How are you? Hello. Mother-in-law. I'm fine. Listen. Are you busy? I'd like to stop by to talk about Sophie's birthday. I was thinking of throwing a little party. From her tone, I could tell she was weighing whether it was safe to let me in. Okay. You can come. 20 minutes later, I was at my son's house, the recorder already on inside my sleeve, my heart pounding like a war drum. Susan greeted me with a strained smile, trying to mask her discomfort. Come in. Mom, would you like some coffee? Of course, I replied, choosing a strategic spot on the sofa, the very place where I had once seen her and Richard plotting together. While she went into the kitchen to make coffee, I leaned toward the recorder and whispered, "I'm at Paul and Susan's house. March 15th. 2 p.m. I came to talk about family matters. When she returned, I began my carefully disguised interrogation. Susan, may I ask you something a little personal? Of course, she answered, though I could see her guard was up. Have you noticed anything strange about Richard lately? I could practically see the gears turning in her head. Strange how, like going out more often, coming home late, seeming distant with me. After 35 years of marriage, you can feel these things. She sipped her coffee, stalling for time before responding. Mother, Richard has always been devoted to his work. Maybe it's just a tough phase at the shop. Maybe so. I nodded. But you're a lawyer. If a woman my age suspected her husband of, well, cheating, what should she do? Coffee nearly sprayed out of her nose. Why would you think about that? Susan asked, trying and failing to appear calm. Oh, nothing specific. Just that my friend in the neighborhood is going through that. Her husband's been going out a lot, with silly excuses. And you think, Richard, I don't know. Susan, sometimes the wife is the last to know. Isn't she? She was silent for what felt like an eternity. Mother, may I give some advice? Of course. If it were your friend, I'd say, don't jump to conclusions. Older men sometimes lose direction. But that doesn't always mean cheating. It could just be a midlife crisis. A midlife crisis at 62. How creative. You're right. I agreed. But suppose the suspicion turned out to be true. What should she do then? First, she'd have to be sure. You can't blow up a marriage just on suspicion. Then, if it's true, she should talk to a lawyer about dividing assets. Things like that. And how would she be sure? She gave me a strange look. Why are you so interested in this? Mother, because my friend is suffering. She doesn't know whether to investigate or let it go. Look, as a lawyer, I always say this: if there's doubt, it's better to clarify. Otherwise, she'll live with torment forever. And if she finds out it's true, then it's up to her whether she wants to save the marriage or divorce. And what about the financial side? Exactly where I wanted her. That depends on the assets. If the marriage is under community property, she's entitled to half of what was acquired during the marriage. But if she has property in her own name from before the marriage, it's harder for the husband. Those aren't divided. Oh, that's interesting, I said, feigning surprise. My friend inherited a house from her mother before getting married, so she'd be protected. Yes. But if there were renovations or improvements made during the marriage, it could cause complications. Renovations. The exact word I had overheard in their secret conversation. What kind of complications? If the husband invested money in repairs or upgrades, he could claim reimbursement, even if the house is only in the wife's name. Oh, I see. So she'd need a good lawyer. A good lawyer like her. We continued talking for another half hour. And every answer she gave only confirmed what I already knew. She was laying out the legal groundwork to rob me. Every question I asked under the guise of my friend was answered like a lecture on how to dismantle a 35-year marriage. When I left, I had it all, not only the recording, but also proof that she knew exactly what assets I had and how to attack them. That evening, when Richard came home with his prearranged excuse about company estimates, I was ready for the next step in my plan. How was the bid today? Darling, I asked. Serving dinner. Difficult, he said. They wanted such a low price, it wouldn't even cover the materials. Lies, I knew exactly where he had been all afternoon. That's too bad, I said. But don't worry. Sometimes the tricky deals sort themselves out. He gave me a strange look, as if trying to read whether there was hidden meaning in my words. There was, but he wouldn't find out until the right moment. For now. I was still gathering evidence. And like any good teacher, I knew you never give the final lesson before finishing the whole curriculum. For the next 2 weeks, I continued playing the perfect wife, the sweet mother-in-law, all while they dug their own graves deeper and deeper. Richard invented increasingly elaborate excuses for his absences, and I carefully recorded every lie in a small notebook, as if grading an essay full of errors. Today I'm stopping by my friend John's to help with a few things, he said one Tuesday. John had been dead for 3 years. I didn't say a word, I just wrote it down. Using a dead friend as an alibi, 0 points for creativity. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet investigation. I discovered Susan had opened a new bank account 4 months ago, right when the suspicious withdrawals from our savings had started. I also found out she had requested reissued ownership documents for all our family properties, under the excuse of organizing files. Organizing files. In reality, she was organizing a transfer of my assets straight into her own hands. But the discovery that broke me the most came when I went to pick up Sophie at school. Her teacher, Mrs. Carmen, pulled me aside. "Mrs. Barbara, may I have a word in private?" "Of course." "Carmen, what is it?" "It's about Sophie. She drew some pictures that worry me." She showed me one of Sophie's drawings from art class. It was a family, a man, a woman, a little girl, and in the far corner of the paper, an old woman standing all alone, tears streaming down her face. I asked her who the people in the picture were. "Mrs. Carmen continued. She said it was her dad, her mom, herself, and in the corner was her grandma. Sad, because she was about to be left behind. My heart shattered right then. My granddaughter, just 6 years old, was already being conditioned to accept my removal from her family. They weren't just stealing my money, they were stealing my granddaughter. "Do you know what's going on at home?" Carmen asked softly. "I'm investigating," I replied, slipping the drawing into my purse. "Thank you for telling me." I left the school with a determination I had never felt in my life. This wasn't about money or property anymore. It was about protecting my family from the poison seeping into it. That night, I called my sister Martha in Boston. "Martha, the time has come. I need a good lawyer. But it has to be discreet. I've been waiting for this call. I know just the person. Attorney Michael Ferris. He specializes in family law. He helped me when Tom tried to pull tricks during the divorce. Does he handle cases in smaller towns? He does. And even better, he despises crooked lawyers. If you have proof, your daughter-in-law is setting you up. He'll be more than eager to expose her. By Friday, Attorney Michael arrived in my town. We met in a small, discreet bakery in downtown Columbus. Far from the prying eyes of neighbors, I brought my neatly organized file recordings, bank statements, receipts, notes, even Sophie's drawing. Michael was around 50. Graying hair, round glasses that made him look like a professor. He put me at ease instantly. "Mrs. Barbara," he said after reviewing everything carefully. "In 25 years of practice, I've rarely seen a case documented this thoroughly. You don't just have enough to protect yourself, you have enough to counterattack. What do you recommend I do? First, secure your assets immediately. The house you inherited is safe. But the joint account must be frozen today. I can actually do that. Not only can you, but you must. I'll draft a temporary freeze request, citing suspicious transfers. That's your legal right. And after that, we'll give them a lesson they'll never forget." He explained the plan. Monday morning. Right away. Freeze all the accounts exactly when Richard would be trying to withdraw money for another afternoon date. At the same time, we'd file a complaint with the Bar Association against Susan for exploiting confidential information from a client because technically, when I sought her legal advice, I could be considered her client. And one more thing. Michael smiled. If they file for divorce first, we'll be ready with a mountain of evidence of fraud. The judge will be very interested. I left the bakery feeling like a student who had finally grasped the hardest lesson of life. On Saturday, Richard claimed he'd be working a half day at the shop. Of course, he didn't go, but this time, I didn't follow him. Instead, I went to see the person I had been avoiding for weeks, my son, Paul. I arrived at his house in the mid-afternoon. Susan was out shopping, or at least that's what Paul believed. Mom. What a surprise, he said, hugging me tightly as always. Hello. Son. Can we talk? Of course. Sophie's at a friend's house. Do you want some coffee? We sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where I had interrogated Susan days earlier. Paul. I need to tell you something very difficult. He looked at me. Worried. What is it? Mom, are you sick? No. I'm fine. But your family isn't. I told him everything, every discovery, every lie, every piece of the puzzle I had assembled over the past weeks. I showed him photos of receipts, played him recordings, explained how the savings had been drained. Paul's face went pale as a sheet. Mom, are you sure, son? After 40 years of teaching, I know how to tell truth from lies, and this is the most painful truth I've ever had to face. He buried his head in his hands. I can't believe this. Susan and Dad, my own father, they never thought you'd find out. They thought they could keep me in the dark forever. I took my son's hand. And what about Sophie? He asked, his voice breaking. I handed him the drawing her teacher had given me. They're preparing her to forget me. Paul, your daughter already senses something is wrong. We cried together at the kitchen table. My son, realizing he had married a woman capable of betraying the very family that had embraced her, and me, watching my child suffer because of the greed of those who should have protected him. What will you do? Mom, I'll protect myself and I'll protect you and Sophie from this mess. Is there anything I can do for you? You just need to stay strong and trust me. In the coming weeks, many things will happen. Your wife will try to convince you that I'm losing my mind, that I'm making things up. I'll never believe her over you, Paul said firmly. And one more thing. Son, don't say anything to her yet. Let them think they're winning. Sunday, the last day of my old life, I hosted a family lunch. I invited everyone, Richard, Paul, Susan, and Sophie. A farewell feast. Though no one knew it but me, I cooked with more care than ever before. Italian pasta, the family loved. Braised beef with garlic bread. Silky smooth flan. The table was beautifully set, with embroidered linens and the fine china I only brought out for special occasions. Throughout the lunch, I watched Richard and Susan exchange conspiratorial glances. They thought themselves invisible. But to someone who knew what to look for, every gesture was a confession. Wonderful lunch. Mother-in-law, Susan said with a forced smile. Thank you, I replied. This may be the last time I prepare a meal like this, with all of us together. Everyone stared at me in surprise. Why? Grandma Sophie asked. Oh, sweetheart. Life changes. We never know what the future holds. Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Barb, why are you saying such strange things? It's nothing, I said, serving Sophie more flan. Just that life is full of surprises. Sometimes we discover things that change everything. The atmosphere grew tense. Paul looked at me, understanding exactly what I meant. Susan fidgeted. Richard tried to change the subject. So, Paul, how's work at the bank? But I wasn't done. Do you know what surprises me most about life? I continued. It's how people can pretend for so long, holding on to a lie for months, even years. It must be exhausting. Mom, Paul interrupted. Would you like me to help clear the dishes? No. Son. Today I want to do everything myself. Tomorrow is Monday. And it will be a very different day. When everyone left, I washed the dishes and thought, yes. This was my last meal as the naive Barbara. Starting Monday, they would meet a different version of me, a version even I had never known. Before bed, I reread all my notes, arranged every document attorney Michael Ferris would need the next morning, and recorded one final message on my phone, tomorrow, March 25th, 8 a.m. My fight for justice begins. This isn't revenge, it's a lesson. Because some people in this world only learn the hard way. That night I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow would be the final exam. And I was more ready than ever to teach the most important lesson of my career. Monday, at 8 a.m. Richard left for the garage as usual, kissed my cheek as usual, and promised to be home for lunch as usual. The only difference was that today I knew those habits were about to end. At 8:30, I stood at the bank doors with attorney Michael. Ready? Mrs. Barbara, he asked. More than ready. I replied. I've been waiting for this. 15 minutes later, every joint account was frozen. Cards canceled. Savings locked. Any transaction now required both account holders with proper ID. What now, I asked. Now we wait for their reaction. Michael smiled. It will be interesting. We didn't have to wait long. At 10:15, my phone rang. Richard. His voice frantic. Barb. Are you home? Yes. What's going on? I've been at the bank for over an hour, trying to withdraw money. And they said there's a problem with the account. Did you do something? Do something. Like what I played innocent. I don't know. Update paperwork. Make some changes. No. Richard. I didn't do anything. That's strange. I'll call the bank and check. Of course. I didn't call. Instead, I called Michael. He's taken the bait, he said. And now, we wait for reaction number 2. He'll be rushing to call Susan any minute. Just as expected. At 11 o'clock. The phone rang again. Susan. Mother-in-law. Richard just called and said, you two are having issues with the bank. Is there anything I can do to help? Oh. How kind of you. Dear. I replied sweetly. I heard something about an account freeze. You're a lawyer. So you must know how to handle it. There was a pause. I knew she was calculating. If you'd like, I can look at the paperwork. Perfect. Could you come over now? Sure. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and smiled. She was walking straight into the trap. 20 minutes later, Susan sat in the living room, acting as though she were doing me a favor. But this time, the one in control was me. So, mother-in-law, tell me what happened at the bank. Oh, I don't understand these things, I said, playing the doddering old woman. Richard said he tried to withdraw money but couldn't. And the staff mentioned freezes and paperwork, all very confusing. Do you have the manager's number I can call and ask? Of course, I said, handing her the note with Mr. James's number. But before you call, let me ask you something. Of course. As a lawyer, do you think someone could be deliberately interfering with our accounts? She stared at me. Why would you think that? Because I suspect it, I answered, looking her directly in the eye. Suspect what? I think someone's been touching our money without me knowing. She swallowed hard. Why would you think that? Because after 35 years of marriage, a wife knows her husband's habits. And lately, too many things don't add up. Susan grew flustered. She was trapped. If she reassured me too much, I'd suspect her. If she agreed, she'd betray her accomplice. Mother-in-law. Maybe it's best you speak to him directly about these suspicions. Speak to him, I repeated. And if he denies everything? How would I know what's true? I picked up the phone and called the bank right in front of her. Hello. Mr. James. This is Barbara. I'm here with my daughter-in-law, who's a lawyer. And I want to understand what's happening with the account. Mrs. Barbara. Mr. James replied. As I explained to Mr. Richard, the joint accounts have been temporarily frozen due to suspected unusual activity. Unusual activity. I repeated loudly, making sure Susan heard. What kind of activity? Frequent withdrawals in small amounts. There was also an attempt to transfer money to a third-party account without the consent of both account holders. Susan's face turned pale. And who requested this freeze? I asked. You did. Through your legal representative. Oh. Right. I said, pretending to remember. I forgot I'd hired a lawyer to handle finances. I hung up and looked at Susan innocently. Terrible memory. Isn't it? Forgot I had hired a lawyer. You hired a lawyer, she asked, her voice trembling. Yes. A friend in Boston recommended him. Said he was very good at cases involving... What was it? Oh, yes. Marital fraud. The air in the living room grew thick. Susan now understood the victim. She thought she could swallow whole, had uncovered everything, and had legal weapons in hand. Mother-in-law, she said, struggling to keep calm. Can I ask why you did that? Did what? Dear, hired a lawyer without discussing it with the family. Is it time already? I stood. Walked to the cabinet where I kept my teaching papers. And returned with the neatly organized file. Susan, I said, sitting down and opening the folder. 40 years in the classroom taught me that when you catch someone cheating, pretending not to see it is useless. I pulled out the first set bank statements with withdrawals highlighted in yellow. $6,000. Susan. $6,000 broken into $1,000 pieces vanished from our savings in 3 months. She tried to say something. But I continued, and there's more. I said, laying out receipts. A downtown motel. Gift shops. Even rent for an apartment. All paid with the money I scraped together from weekend tutoring. Mother-in-law. I can explain. Can you really? I asked. Then pulled the digital recorder from the file. Then explain this. I pressed play. Her own voice filled the room, with the length of the marriage and community property laws. You're entitled to half of everything acquired after the wedding. Susan's face drained of color. Explain this one too, I said, playing another clip, even if it's in her name from before the marriage. I can argue joint investment through 35 years of repairs and improvements. She made a move to stand. But I wasn't finished. And finally, I said, pulling out Sophie's drawing. Explain why my 6-year-old granddaughter has already been prepared to forget me. The moment she saw the drawing, she broke down in tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were the tears of someone caught red-handed. How did you find out? She asked between sobs. Susan. I've spent 40 years catching students in lies. Did you really think a 62-year-old man and a 30-year-old lawyer could fool me, just then? The front door opened. Richard stormed in from the bank. Agitation written all over him. Barb, he barked from the doorway. What's this about hiring a lawyer? He burst into the room like a storm. Then froze when he saw Susan crying and my paperwork spread across the table. Sit down. Richard, I said, strangely calm. We need to talk. Talk about what? What's this crazy account freezing nonsense? Crazy, I stood, staring straight at the man I had lived with for 35 years. Crazy as finding out you stole from me to fund your mistress. The effect was like a bomb going off in the room. Richard was stunned for a moment before trying to deny it. Mistress, you've lost your mind. Barbara. Lost my mind, I repeated. No. Richard. Losing your mind is when a woman works 35 years to build something, only to discover her husband is handing it all to her daughter-in-law. I picked up the recorder and played the clip I had captured the first time I caught them together. As soon as the old woman signs, we'll have it all. Just like we planned. Susan's voice filled the room. Wait, that wasn't even the clip I wanted. I pressed another. Barbara doesn't suspect a thing. The gossipy neighbor's voice rang out. Of course not. Mrs. Claire. Richard says she's so naive. Now it was Susan's own voice, admitting it to the whole neighborhood. Richard collapsed onto the sofa, as though all the air had been sucked out of him. Barb, he tried. I cut him off. Now it's my turn. You two had months to speak up. Now it's my time. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden I had planted with my own hands. Every single shrub and tree. 35 years. Richard. 35 years of waking up early to make your coffee. 35 years of washing your clothes. 35 years of nursing you when you were sick. And in return, you planned to rob me. It's not robbery. Susan tried to argue. It's a legal division of assets. It's robbery. I snapped. Because you both knew this house was my inheritance. You knew most of the savings came from my sweat as a teacher. And yet you still schemed to take it all with your little legal tricks. And the worst part, I turned sharply to her, was how you exploited the trust I gave you. I treated you like a daughter. I helped you in your career. I loved your child as if she were my own. Mother-in-law, she stammered. I am no longer your mother-in-law. I cut her off. A mother-in-law belongs to someone who has a daughter-in-law. What I have is a venomous snake that deceived me for months. I turned to Richard. And you. My voice trembled with restrained fury. You were my partner. My companion. The father of my son. The grandfather of my granddaughter. And you traded it all for what, a fling with a woman 32 years younger than you? He opened his mouth. But I silenced him. What hurts me most isn't the betrayal. It's the coldness. You sat here for months, plotting how to destroy me in this very room, while I served you coffee, thinking I was caring for my family. I pulled a paper from the file. But you made one mistake. I said. You underestimated a teacher, and teachers are experts at catching cheaters. I held the paper up. A formal complaint to the State Bar Association against attorney Susan Miller for misusing client information for personal gain, violating professional confidentiality, and attempting to defraud a vulnerable person. Susan went pale as a sheet. This will ruin my career, she whispered. You should have thought about that sooner. I replied, every action has consequences. That's the very first lesson we teach children. Richard finally managed to speak. Barb, we can talk. Work this out within the family. Family? I almost laughed from the tension. Which family? Richard, the one you were destroying. Or the new one you were building with my daughter-in-law. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. And now I give you a choice. Sign the separation agreement, keep only what is truly yours, and leave my house in peace. Or we go to court with all the evidence I have. And you walk away with nothing but the title of fraud. Silence weighed heavy in the room for a long time. If I agree to the settlement, he asked. His voice defeated. You pack your things and leave today. You keep the garage, it's yours anyway. Keep your car. But the house, the savings, the belongings, they're all mine. After all, I gave a bitter smile. Isn't that the asset division you two dreamed of? Susan shakily stood. I'm leaving. This place is hell. Yes. Go. I nodded. But before you do, you'll call Paul and confess everything you've done. He deserves to know exactly what kind of mother his daughter has. I won't. You will. Attorney Michael Ferris said, stepping in from the door I had intentionally left open. Because if you don't, we'll file all of this evidence with the court in the separation case. And I assure you, the court will not be nearly as generous as Barbara. Susan looked at Richard as if waiting for him to defend her. But he only bowed his head to the floor. Completely broken. Fine, she said. I'll call Paul. And she did. Right in front of me. She confessed everything to my son. She told him about the affair with Richard. About the plan to rob me. About the months of lies. I heard my son crying on the other end. And my heart shattered for him. When she hung up, Attorney Michael Ferris handed papers to Richard. There are 3 copies, he explained. A mutual separation agreement. Renunciation of any rights to the house. And a commitment not to approach Mrs. Barbara, except for purely family matters involving the granddaughter. Richard signed them all without even reading. An hour later, they had both left my house. Susan stormed off in anger, honking her horn like a sulking teenager. Richard carried a small suitcase, glancing back only once before getting into the car. I remained alone in the living room, surrounded by papers, the recorder, and evidence. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. Not emptiness, but freedom. 2 hours later, Paul arrived with Sophie. My son's eyes were red, but he hugged me tightly the moment he saw me. Mom, forgive me, he said. I didn't know anything. There's nothing to forgive. Son, you're a victim too. So what happens now? Mom, now we start over, I said, holding Sophie in my arms. The 3 of us. The way it should be. 6 months later, Paul and Sophie moved in with me. He transferred his job to work closer to home. Sophie has been going to therapy for children to process everything. But she's back to drawing pictures of happy families again. Susan lost her license to practice law for a few years and moved to another city. Richard sold the garage and left too. I heard he's in Chicago now, trying to start over. As for me, I went back to tutoring, right here in this house. I turned the old living room into a bright little classroom, welcoming students every afternoon. Sophie loves helping, bringing drinks and snacks for Grandma's students. I didn't remarry, and I don't want to. At 64, I've realized I can be completely happy just being myself. I have my son, my granddaughter, my students, my home, and most importantly, I have my dignity. People ask me if I'm still angry at Richard. Honestly, no. I just feel sorry for him. He traded 35 years of real life for a few months of illusion. And now all he has left is loneliness, old age, and no family. Me. On the other hand, I'm alive, strong, and surrounded by true love. Life has taught me there's no use wasting energy hating those who betray us. It's better to use that energy to build a better life. And that's exactly what I'm doing. The other day, Sophie asked if I was sad that her grandpa wasn't around anymore. No. Sweetheart, I told her, I'm happy. Because now our home is filled only with people who truly love each other. And that's the truth. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. If you were in my place, what would you do? Your words might brighten someone's day. Enstay.